Hello and welcome to a joint China Global South, China in Africa podcast, both, of course, proud members of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. First, my apologies for my congested voice. I spent a wonderful week in South Africa last week at the African Investigative Journalism Conference, and it was great to see everybody, so thank you for all of the wonderful time there. But the weather became a bit unseasonably cold in Johannesburg, and a lot of folks got sick along the way, so not surprisingly, I picked up something and brought it back here to Southeast Asia. Pity the poor guy that had to sit next to me on the flight from Joburg back to Singapore. Yeah, I was that guy sniffling and sneezing that you never want to sit next to on a long-haul flight. So to my friend in 33G, my most sincere apologies. Okay. Today, we're going to talk about just an absolutely fascinating topic. During my time in South Africa, and a couple of weeks ago, I was in Indonesia, and of course, back here in Vietnam, the conversations that I've been having with people in this space, that is, journalists, diplomats, policymakers, scholars, they're remarkably similar. And it all comes down to one question that keeps coming up. Where do we fit in the global value chain? Now, this is not a new question. But there's a new urgency to it in light of the radical changes in the global trading system is undergoing since Donald Trump's return to the White House back in January. And of course, also in light of China's new 5-year plan that was revealed a couple of weeks ago at the 4th plenum in Beijing. And while the US is definitely throwing a wrench in a lot of things lately, China in many ways for developing countries is the big challenge here. Unlike other developing countries that have moved up the value chain from agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy manufacturing and ultimately to high technology and services, they shed those industries they no longer want to do as they advance. So South Korea and Taiwan stopped producing sneakers and tennis rackets as they started to manufacture more chips in cars, leaving countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Bangladesh to take up that work. Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping has made it clear that even as China becomes one of the world's most advanced chip-making countries, it also wants to retain the dominance in manufacturing sneakers and tennis rackets. This presents a huge problem for developing countries that have to confront the reality that whatever they manufacture will likely have to compete against the dreaded, and I say this in quotes, China price. And this is going to be the focus of two conversations that we're going to have this week with people who have been at the forefront of this issue. On Friday, we'll speak with author Dan Wang about his new book, Breakneck, that dissects China's strength as an engineering culture that's built the world's most formidable industrial economy. And today, we're going to look at it from the other side, how developing countries can fare in this new economy. James Kynge is a multi-award-winning journalist who spent 28 years at the Financial Times, both as Beijing bureau chief and subsequently China global editor. His book, Global Tech Wars, China's Race to Dominate, that came out earlier this year, provides a fascinating look at China's rapidly expanding technology supremacy, particularly in developing countries. The book, which is more of an audio documentary than a standard audiobook, I really encourage everybody to listen to it, includes on-scene reporting from Bremen in Germany, Lagos in Nigeria, Phoenix in the US, Taipei, Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and several other places that conjure the voices behind China's expanding tech footprint. He joins us from Chatham House, where he is a resident scholar there. We want to thank you for your time today, James. It's really an honor to have you on the program as a multi-decade follower of your fascinating reporting work.
Thank you so much, Eric. What a very kind introduction. I must say the feeling's mutual. I've been listening to your podcast and reading your work now for a good long time. It's really a great pleasure to be here.
Wow, that's quite an honor. You start your book with the $6 toaster, and that really gets to the crux of the problem that many developing countries are going to face. Because I said if Vietnam or Nigeria want to move up, they're going to have to be able to build a $6 toaster. Can you talk to us about why the $6 toaster was both the starting point of your book and why it's important in this story of China's move to dominate so much of the global manufacturing sector?
Well, I mean, Eric, I really think it's as you've just described in your intro, In the old days, we all used to talk about the flying geese model. So the flying geese model, as you're well aware, was the model by which when a country climbed the value chain, climbed the technology ladder, it would shed some of its manufacturing capacity, the lower cost portion to lower cost countries. So, for instance, when China began to make computer chips or AI or some of the latest space technology, then the toasters would migrate to a country which had a lower cost base. But what we've seen with China quite comprehensively so far is that the flying geese model has broken down. And I think the main reason for this is automation. If you look at the deployment of factory robots in China, it's absolutely off the charts. And so what's happening in China is that the cost base remains low because of the deployment of these robots that can work 24 hours a day. They don't take breaks, they don't take holiday, they don't need HR, etc., etc. And so China can keep producing low cost items at extremely low costs. And even these days, it can make these toasters cheaper now than it used to even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's the reason why the flying geese model has broken down. But this has huge implications for the rest of the global south, because it means that as China climbs the tech ladder, these countries across the global south will not be receiving anything like the amount of low-cost manufacturing investment that they might have hoped for even as recently as 10 years ago.
That's right. So 10 years ago, there was this expectation that as China moved up, it would offshore a lot of that low-end manufacturing to Thailand, Vietnam, even to Ethiopia and Africa and around the world. That has not transpired, in part because, as you say, automation. But talk to us also about some of the other factors. Dan talks about in his book the fact that there's 100 million people that still live in China at basically a Botswana level of income, about $800 per month. And so there is an ample workforce there to build these $6 toasters, even though automation is doing a lot of that work as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the other thing about China. Uh, we shouldn't really think of China just as another country. We should think of it more as a kind of continent. China embraces every reality possible, sort of known to man, all within the space of one national unit, all within the space of one nation. And so, it is possible in China to have extremely rich billionaires. China's got plenty of them. And at the other end of the scale, as you say, to have 100 million workers working at extremely low wages. So that's another reason for the breakdown of this sort of so-called flying geese model.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about another aspect of the book that you raised, which is something that more and more people are talking about. These are these industrial clusters that have helped to really give China a key advantage over other competitors in the global manufacturing space. So you talk about the manufacturing in terms of automation. It's interesting because I have a friend here who runs one of the largest baked goods providers in Vietnam. He said he went to China, and there's apparently a whole town in Guangxi province that just makes automation tools for baked goods. In the town, there are parts suppliers for that. There's engineering support for it. There's an entire cluster just around baked good automation. You highlighted this phenomenon when you went to Huaqiangbei, which is this technology supermarket in Shenzhen, again, a technology cluster. Talk to us about the importance of these clusters of technology and what you found there and why it gives China such a distinct advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think our audiobook opens with an interview with a man called Noah Zirkin. He comes from the US, actually. I believe he's a New Yorker. And we're asking him, why is he there working in this, this wholesale market, Huaqiangbei, right in the middle of Shenzhen? He has his office there. He's an inventor. And we went into his office and we saw what he's inventing. The day we arrived, he was inventing what's called an augmented reality headset. But of course, as with all inventors, it wasn't working on the day that we were there. But the point was that he said, I'm here because you can literally buy everything. So as an inventor, you need to source components within, a short period of time to build the stuff that you're prototyping. And he said that within the Pearl River Delta, so within a day's journey of Shenzhen, you can literally buy anything. And he sort of said, we asked him, what can't you buy? And he said, that's such a hard question. I reckon I could probably go downstairs now in this market and come up with the parts I needed to buy to make a space module. So, it really is extraordinary. The other thing, Eric, as you will well know, is that all of the components on sale in that market are sold at a fraction of the price of the same components abroad, being sold abroad. And so I think that, this encapsulates the superiority, the unassailable superiority of the Chinese supply chain. You can buy anything, it's very high tech, and it's cheaper than anywhere else in the world. And I think, Noah Zirkin's story really shows that. And you mentioned clusters. I mean, there is no industrial cluster in the world that even comes close to rivaling the Pearl River Delta. You can literally buy everything within a day's journey of Shenzhen.
It's really something remarkable. And unless you've seen it, I've spent quite a bit of time there, and you obviously were there. It's hard to explain to people the scale at which all this is operating at. I mean, the scale of Huaqiang Bay, the scale of the Pearl River Delta in terms of these clusters. But okay, unassailable is the word that you've used. If you are sitting in a country like here in Vietnam or in Nigeria or anywhere, actually, what do you take away from this? Is there any hope that you're going to be able to manufacture something that's going to rival the cost and scale of what China can produce?
This is a really key question, and it's not just places in the global south that are facing this. It's also countries in Europe and the United States itself. China's rise to manufacturing superiority has not been unheralded. I mean, people like you and I have been talking about this for many years now. But the policymakers in the West, I would say, have been very slow to pick this up. They've been very slow to realize what is actually coming down the track. And so as we stand now in 2025, it's very hard to see that many sectors in which any country in the global south or in the West could really rival the speed, the cost, and the technology content that China's putting out these days. So, I mean, this really defines the challenge both for China and the rest of the world. Why does it define a challenge for China? Surely this is what they've all been hoping for. I would argue not. As you know, this year we will see China's trade surplus with the rest of the world exceed $1 trillion US. I would argue that this is highly unsustainable. China is facing a big trade backlash. We've already seen it in the United States with the tariffs and the entity list and various administrative controls. We're beginning to see murmurs of this, or the foothills of this, over here in the EU. And I imagine in the global south as well, there's deep misgivings about China's manufacturing superiority, which, as you've just pointed out, goes right from the top to pretty much the bottom of the value chain. And that's what makes it so difficult to compete with. So, I mean, the answer to your question is very hard. I think that some countries will have to self-strengthen. There will be countries that have to indulge in industrial policy. There'll be countries that have to find niches within the Chinese supply chain. But it's not going to be easy, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, we spoke with some clothing manufacturers who said they're competing against Shein and Temu, where people are buying $15 shirts and having it shipped on AliExpress all the way into South Africa, cutting them out. I mean, and they just say there's no way to compete on a big scale against something like Shein. And this is not only in South Africa, but it's around the world. We're starting to see some pushback. Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and even Vietnam have floated the idea of tariffs, but there hasn't been any real pushback. But when people come to you and say, James, you've identified the problem, but what's the solution? How does a country in the global south, for example, break out of the traditional role of selling raw materials to China and then buying back finished goods, which has been the way that it's been with these countries for centuries, dating back to colonialism? Is there any way a country like Nigeria could sell a finished product to a country like China? Do you ever see that happening in your lifetime?
I mean, never say never. I do think it's important that countries really grip this problem. As I said, not just in the global south, but in the West as well. I think the first step is realization. The next step is analysis of what the real problem is, the depth of it, the scale of it, the scope of it. And then there needs to be a policy-making response, which would incorporate things like moving to China to do R&D, or inviting Chinese foreign direct investment into your country. And it would incorporate self-strengthening of local companies, or inviting in investment from other countries around the world. So I think there's a range of different options for countries. But the first step of this has to be, this is going to be hard. It is going to be very difficult. And China needs to recognize this too, because China may well blow up the world of trade if it doesn't recognize how its superiority in terms of its supply chain is going to squeeze other countries out. How big is the Chinese trade surplus going to get before their, trade just breaks down? That's really a fundamental question.
Well, of course, there's winners and losers in this. And we talked about the $15 Shein dress that comes to a place like South Africa. That's great for consumers. So this huge trade surplus that China is building is on the backs of low-cost exports that a lot of people are benefiting from in countries where they have very little disposable income. It puts pressure on producers who can't compete with that. So again, winners and losers, depending on how you see it. Xi Jinping, though, has learned a very valuable lesson watching what's happened in the US and Europe, though, is that deindustrialization can also lead to political radicalization. So do you foresee that Xi will at any point pull back on the industrialization to allow for some of these countries to take over the sneakers and the tennis rackets? It doesn't seem like it in the 5-year plan, nor from Xi's rhetoric.
There's very little sense of that. As you say, I've read the proposals for the 5-year plan. There's very little sense that China has imbibed, the pain of the global south and of other countries. I think it will have to in the future, because I think this is going to be very uncomfortable for China. But so far, I don't think we're there. And the other thing, Eric, is that we've been talking a lot about the $6 toaster. What about the $6,000 humanoid robot that China has just produced, or another humanoid robot that's just been released that costs $1,400 So China's doing the China price, as you called it, right at the very cutting edge of technology, and at the very, or almost at the bottom end of technology. The reason I mentioned the cutting edge of technology is that this does provide, I think, a glimmer of hope for other countries, because if you can buy really cheap automotive machinery, including humanoid robots, from China, then you can start to maybe manufacture things fairly cheaply in your own country, or you can give rise to a service industry that can generate more income. So I don't want to be wholly negative about this. I mean, there's a lot happening. China's changing very quickly. And the technology coming out of China surely represents some kind of a benefit for mankind as well as a problem.
Well, certainly, and again, we're going to close our discussion on the auto space. You had a chance to drive in a BYD car. That's not unusual now around the world. In just the past 12 months alone, I mean, just the past year in Vietnam, we went from no Chinese cars to they're everywhere. And in South Africa, it's the same situation. They're popping up all over Indonesia. I talked to one auto analyst here in Vietnam, and he said something very interesting. He said in 5 years, Chinese cars will dominate the entire auto sector in this country. That is a remarkable trajectory if that in fact has happening. But they're coming in with cars that are a third to a half cheaper than Ford, Toyota, and Kias, yet packed with technology that consumers like. Cars is one of this automation, one of these kind of technologies you've talked about that could transform mobility in many parts of the world just because of the cost structure that they're operating at.
Exactly. And, you mentioned Vietnam, but here in the UK, we're having the same trend. There's a Chinese car company called Leap Motor. Its sales in the first 9 months of the year are up 7,000%. We're seeing BYD cars everywhere. We're seeing it's really extraordinary. And as you say, there are pluses and minuses. The minus is that it's going to be very hard for European car companies or car companies anywhere to compete with this new brand of super cheap, high-tech Chinese electric vehicles. On the other side of it, it means that people who've never dreamt about buying a car before are going to be able to buy a car. And that's going to change the dynamics of their economy. When I was in Lagos, it's mentioned in the audiobook, I found plenty of examples of this. People who were able to buy a smartphone because the Chinese smartphones cost 1/10 of what Apple iPhones cost. And then they were able to order their entire lives and their business lives through this new technology. And that lifted them from, being an unconnected menial worker to being a guy who ran a tuk-tuk, and had a business. And he was picking people up and taking calls on the phone and doing all kinds of things, and then moving money on the phone and doing all the things you would do on a payment app. So there are two sides to this, but I'm sure that you're absolutely right that the biggest issue, the way in which Chinese manufacturing competitiveness is going to blow other countries out of the water, is going to grab the headlines over the next few years.
It's really the challenge of our times. The book is Global Tech Wars, China's Race to Dominate by James Kynge, a senior research fellow for China and the World with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House, and also a veteran reporter who spent 28 years at the Financial Times in China. James, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your insights, and it was fantastic to have the chance to meet you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Really enjoyed it.
That'll do it for this edition of the China and Africa and the China Global South podcast, a joint edition today. I'll be back again next with Dan Wang, from the author of Breakneck, and we're going to continue our discussion about China's industrial capacity in the world and where developing countries fit on the global supply chain. Until then, thanks so much for listening and for watching.